Yeah, so I've been a little bit quicker getting this one out, haven't I? Also trying out a slightly new audio setup, so that's why you can see my mic in shot. But other than that, let's get on with talking about our first movie today, which is Dark Waters. And I feel like it could be all too easy for me to say that this is just another film that should be a lot better than it is. But I think that would be doing a disservice to the movie as a whole because I really did enjoy Dark Waters. It's a kind of intense, twisted biopic that not only grabbed me hard initially, but also kept my attention throughout its runtime. I love the way the film uses unconventional camera angles, as well as its very misty grey colour palette, creating a sense that our protagonist is stepping into the unknown and is very uncomfortable with it, but also with the knowledge that if he doesn't do anything about this whole situation, no one will. And that feeling of pressure that our protagonist is feeling weighs hard on this movie, especially as the world and the people around him evolve as the years pass. The film does still have some serious problems that stop it from embodying the true best of the year, though. One of these is that the psychological impact of what Rob is doing feels like kind of it was an afterthought in the writing. The one moment of real psychological intensity in this movie, it's in the trailer, and it kind of feels like it was just there for the marketing rather than to drive home any point within the movie. In fact, it's Rob's wife who, to me, feels like she's more psychologically affected by what Rob is doing rather than Rob himself, which takes us to the second huge issue with Dark Waters. That being that despite Anne Hathaway's best efforts in the role, Rob's wife Sarah is just not a well-written character. It all plays out during the sequence where Sarah is getting angry at Rob for spending too much time on his case and not enough time with family. And then we see Rob having to take a pay cut at work, which then leads to him fainting out of stress. Yet in the scene in the hospital, Sarah is mindlessly yelling at Rob's boss for putting too much pressure on him, completely absent-minded to the fact that she is just as responsible for what is unfolding, given that she was unnecessarily angry at him earlier, just a few minutes earlier in the film at this point, and it doesn't make me want to sympathize with her. But overall, those are nitpicks in an otherwise really good film. I would love to be able to join the group of critics who are claiming that this is essential viewing based on its message alone, but unfortunately I can't say that this embodies the true best of the year. Too many missed opportunities and little character problems to hold it back for me, despite how much I really respect this movie. As far as biopics in 2020 go, I'll stick with Richard Jewell, but this is a fairly close second. Okay, now moving on to Downhill. You know, part of me just wants to say that we have Marriage Story now, so do we seriously need any other movies, especially big budget movies, about relationships falling apart when we already have that masterpiece? Well, it doesn't really matter because someone decided to make Downhill anyway, and in short, it's not very good at all. The only thing that really impressed me about this movie was right at the very start, where you have some really decent wide shots of the mountainous landscape, really setting the scene quite well, but the film really does not have much more going for it beyond that. And while there will no doubt be those people who insist that however much the film might not look like it's got a lot going for it on the surface, that's because it's trying to emphasize much more smaller emotions, like Marriage Story for instance. But given how broad this movie goes in terms of characters, it's kind of hard to argue that. Doesn't help that the film anchors its entire narrative around this father being antagonized by this bitchy mother, made further frustrating by the fact that if Billy seriously was terrified during that avalanche, Julia Louis-Dreyfus's performance is not selling it like that, and as a result, it doesn't make me want to root for her character. If anything, my sympathies lie more with Pete, who spends most of the movie being Billy's prop, despite doing nothing wrong. This is the definition of drama for the sake of drama, and it just gets more and more insulting the deeper you get into it. To give this movie the slightest bit of credit, it is clearly trying very hard to communicate its point, and I mean it is trying very hard, but that might be the worst thing. Best illustrated in the ending, which is clearly supposed to be gratifying in the sense of highlighting to the audience that what Pete did was actually pretty reasonable in the end. But in order to feel that sense of gratification, it not only depends on me being on Billy's side throughout all of the movie, which we've already established I'm very much not and can't understand how you possibly could be, but it also demands what I think Pete did in the first place was all that bad, which again I also disagree with. And the way the movie abruptly cuts to black after that moment only goes to highlight how smug the movie really is, how much smarter it thinks it is in comparison to what it actually is. Further problems come from realizing how flat the whole redemption arc of this movie is. Not only when Billy constructs the whole situation where Pete can come and save her, but also in the fact that I don't feel like there's anything Pete needs to be redeemed for. In other words, Downhill is an example of a film that was never likely to be any good to begin with, but how the movie is so determined to make me sympathize with the most aggressively bitchy character it could possibly construct, that's what pushes this into being an outright atrocity. Easily one of the worst movies of the year so far. The title might be the obvious punchline here, but honestly, I don't even care to make the obvious pun. Let's just pretend this never happened. It's a 3 out of 10. Let's just move on. And the movie that we're going to be moving on to is a film I had much more fun with. This is The Invisible Man. This was exactly the kick up the backside that horror needed during the winter months. And I think we can all appreciate it, at least for that. It's certainly not the most immediate or approachable horror movie, thanks to how the film expertly foregrounds the psychological challenges that our main character is facing. But this is one of the few mainstream adjacent horror films that understands that you don't need mindless ambiguity in order to succeed in that genre. In fact, the film is frighteningly direct without a hint of the supernatural, beyond the science fiction elements. In other words, it's willing to emphasize character over everything else, and it makes for an intense and thrilling ride. And that emphasis on character is reflected in how the film builds a relationship between the audience and Cecilia. After all, we don't really get any idea about Cecilia's past beyond her relationship with Adrian, and that anonymity works to the film's advantage, as her relationship with Adrian is not diluted into any other unnecessary commentary. It does mean that Cecilia isn't given much of an identity beyond just being an object for Adrian to torture, but in a way that works for a movie as stone cold as this one. It helps that the cinematography really works in communicating that sense of paranoia, with some of the best moments in the film being those slow, eerie panning shots, which sometimes twist and contort around the subject, emphasizing how something is very wrong. It's a shame that not all the imagery connects to create the same feeling, though. For example, the first real image that you get in this movie is that of the waves crashing against the rocks. It looks visually amazing, and the sound design is gloriously abrasive, but that imagery is never used again, so it just comes across more overblown than it should. Just makes me feel like the producers wanted an interesting way to reveal their title card rather than build any interesting cohesion throughout the narrative using those opening shots. Furthermore, however much I'm generally not too bothered about plot holes, there are some that seriously stick out in this movie. When Cecilia finds Adrian's phone, why doesn't she just keep it with him? Feels like it would be some serious evidence against him. Surely that would be the most obvious thing to do in that situation. Instead, it just turns up for one scene and then inexplicably disappears. What's also disappointing is the fact that however much this film was marketed as kind of like a horror sci-fi hybrid, it's unfortunate that most of the science fiction elements of the narrative feel like an afterthought, especially considering how the technology of the suit that Adrian uses is never explored beyond the fact that, well, it just has cameras on it. I understand building a sense of unknowing, but I wish that there were more elements of the film where the sci-fi elements were more foregrounded, just to make it a little bit more dynamic and interesting, narratively. And there are some bizarre moments in the film that just make me go, what? Like Cecilia trashing James's house and shooting a guy and facing no consequences for either of those actions. But to end this on a positive note, I would love to praise the acting, particularly in those sequences where Cecilia and Adrian are fighting. I have no idea how they pulled it off, but Elizabeth Moss really is remarkable. Her physical struggles dealing with Adrian are incredibly convincing. But despite this, I'm still torn on whether or not this is a great movie, but it is certainly well acted, incredibly intense, and incredibly well presented. So despite the plot holes and narrative stuff that hold it back, I still am incredibly confident giving this a 7 out of 10. Still stands out as one of the first solid horror movies I've seen this year. Really good stuff. Okay, so I forgot to actually mention this film last time during my previous vlog when I was going through the movies that I would have been going through in this one, but I would like to spare a few moments to talk about True History of the Kelly Gang. And I will start off by saying this: if anyone was in any doubt about George McKay's acting chops coming out of 1917, this will no doubt silence them. But True History of the Kelly Gang might not end up doing much more beyond that. I certainly did enjoy this movie, but there was also a sense that I wasn't really asking for it. The movie feels smaller in scale than it probably should, and I can't shake the feeling that this is just a few very dramatic and striking moments sandwiched in between a much less interesting movie. It might be brutal and certainly fascinating in terms of its narrative, and it will definitely have a big audience in terms of there are a lot of people who will no doubt really enjoy that kind of thing. But I'd struggle to say this gets quite all the way there for me. One thing I certainly do love is how the narrative is told, with Ned deconstructing how misunderstood he was by society as if he was speaking to his own children. It gives the narrative a sense of lived-in authenticity that works throughout the rest of the movie. The film is technically sound too, but those low-angle close-ups of a furious Ned plowing through his enemies, they might be some of the most visceral and brutal shots that I've seen in a film this year. And even though all those things elevate True History of the Kelly Gang to being a very good movie, it also didn't stick with me anywhere near as much as I'd hoped, especially considering what happens at the end of the movie. And on that note, part of it might be to do with however much I understand the films want to go out on a very dramatic note. The fact that the movie doesn't present how Ned truly was remembered years or maybe even decades removed from his death is a bit disappointing. Is everyone still hostile towards him, or did his writing uncover something that changed their minds? But other than that, this is a movie that I appreciate rather than love. I think I'm just going to stick to the not for me label on this one, even though I did really like it. It's a heavy experience that certainly requires you to be in a specific frame of mind in order to enjoy. And even though that's not a bad thing, and this movie clearly has its place based on some of the acclaim that it's getting, it's not the kind of movie that I can see myself going back to as a result. So let's just give this one a 7 out of 10 and move on to the next one. Okay, moving on to the film that I was most anticipating in February. It came out, just like all of these films, right near the end, and that is Celine Sciamma's new film, Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Now, the obvious reason that I was looking forward to this was, of course, linked to all of the critical acclaim that this movie had received coming up to its UK release. But a lot of things that critics were saying were setting alarm bells off in my mind, like, what if this movie ends up as being all style and no substance? That was certainly something that was weighing hard on my mind walking into the movie theatre for the first time. But coming out of the experience of having seen the film, and I have seen it a lot of times now, I've seen it 5 times in cinemas at the time of this recording, I think I understand why I felt so afraid going into it for the first time, because I don't think anything that anyone could have potentially have written in a review could have appropriately contextualized how incredible this movie is. Portrait of a Lady on Fire is not only the rare movie that has the power to transcend anyone's expectations, but it might be my favorite movie of the year so far. This is the kind of movie that makes me want to watch everything that Celine Sciamma, the director, has worked on in the past and will work on in the future. I was not expecting it, but Portrait of a Lady on Fire is a masterpiece and then some. Almost to the extent that I don't want to talk about this film to anyone for fear that I might spoil it for them if they haven't already seen it. But this film confuses, frustrates, borderline angers me at points, but manages to somehow work all the same. It's not flawless, but it is perfect. And speaking of this movie not being perfect, I'll rattle through a few of the things that I don't like pretty quickly, so we can get on to talking about the really great stuff. However much the film uses a non-linear narrative in order to present its story, with the movie starting in an art class that Marianne is teaching, with a painting catching her eye that one of the students had brought down. I can't help but think it's a bit of a shame that that painting in particular isn't mentioned again. Sure, you get a lot of striking imagery that kind of connects back to what the painting was all about, but given how that painting pretty much kickstarts the whole narrative in the views of the audience, it's kind of a little bit weird that it doesn't come up again in a more direct way. Furthermore, this is a film told in abstraction, with the narrative mostly presented in metaphor, which can make it a challenging watch, and certainly a movie where some of the imagery might appear a little scattered and disconnected if you're watching it for the first time. Although I can confirm, having seen this movie a lot of times, as I said, that kind of fixes itself the more you watch it, the more you pay attention to the little details of the narrative. And the ending certainly isn't perfect either, from a technical perspective. Once Marianne and Eloise finally depart, we flick back to the same art lesson that was at the start of the movie. But then we see Marianne going through a lot of memories that she's had with Eloise since initially leaving her, and the film kind of loses its sense of time. The use of narration suggests that Marianne is recollecting these events, but then the use of continuity editing implies that all of these events are happening in the future after that art lesson. So you can see what I mean when I say the film loses its kind of sense of time. And it makes the ending even more frustrating than it already is. But I get the feeling that all of that might have been intentional on the part of Celine Sciamma, leaving the audience in an intentionally frustrating position in order to properly illustrate Marianne's frustration with being, eternally separated from the love of her life. Made all the more heartbreaking by the fact that that separation between herself and Eloise was partly her own doing. After all, as Marianne acknowledges in the movie, she effectively gives Eloise away to this unnamed Milanese man through the medium of art, a man who neither of them have even met, a serious contrast to Marianne's own choices in life, the fact that she doesn't even think she wants to marry at all. But that whole idea raises the uncomfortable question of where art itself fits within this whole narrative. And that's the awkward thing, because if you were going to pinpoint a bad guy in Portrait of a Lady on Fire, the art itself kind of is that. You can make a pretty credible case for it, because, as I said, it is through the art that Marianne effectively gives Eloise away. The movie sets itself up as a film that's going to celebrate art, but ends up effectively antagonizing it by the end, but not in an evil way. There's a feeling of inevitability through the way the movie ends, especially as the camera zooms in on a helpless Eloise. Despite Marianne saying that she didn't see her, the likelihood is that she probably in fact did. But her consciousness of the fact that she made the choice to merely be content with the memory of Marianne, you could say that she doesn't make the lover's choice, but the poet's, to quote the movie, forces her to avoid acknowledging her at all. Not even the one thing that Marianne insisted would console Eloise can save her now, that being the music. And again, it's frustrating because there's no clear answer here. Like, what could either of them have done better? It adds to the sense of inevitability and predestination that I discussed earlier, but just with the drama turned up uncomfortably high, emphasizing the question of whether or not that story-defining decision was even Eloise's to make. There are so many questions I want answers to, and the film has left me an emotional wreck coming out of it every time I've seen it as a result. It's simply remarkable from every angle, especially when you consider just how emotional it is, and how dramatic yet frustratingly unsatisfying that ending is. Now, I would argue that trying to criticize this film from a technical perspective is almost pointless. As for however pristine the production might be, it seems almost irrelevant to discuss it, given how much the film thrives on abstract symbolism over everything else. But of course, the film is technically excellent, and I'll try to get into why that is during this discussion. First of all, the cinematography is incredibly stately, and the camera movement incredibly fluid and only used when it's absolutely essential. And the framing of each individual shot is pristine, damn near flawless when it comes to foregrounding the emotion of a single moment. The medium close-up of Marianne as she sees that unfinished painting before her is incredibly emotional and revealing to her character, not to mention frighteningly intimate. The medium shot of Eloise around the fire, and even that initial close-up of Eloise as she turns having ran towards the cliffs, where her sister of course died, are gorgeous and beautifully symbolic of the themes that the movie is exploring, amazingly echoed in the final shot of the film. It's almost enough to make you wish that there was more said in the text about Eloise's relationship with her sister. Between the enormous wide shots on the beach to the more intimate close-up cinematography of the trio just playing cards together, it's completely impossible to pick a favorite shot from this movie, I'm fairly certain. But it's far from the only thing doing the heavy lifting here. The editing is also stunning. There's one particular moment where the focus shifts from deep to shallow focus at the perfect time, and it has me in awe every time I see it. For the most part, the editing has a sparing and patient quality to it. I love how the editing cuts straight from Eloise submerging herself in water after hearing the news that Marianne's going to be leaving, straight to her getting out and walking towards Marianne and then sitting down, acting as an exact parallel to what happened earlier on in the story, where the editing cuts from Marianne being in the water trying to save her canvases to straight being back on the boat. The editing foregrounds the fire-water binary that the movie plays with effortlessly. And I can go on to talk about even more technical things. I love the makeup in this movie. I love how it foregrounds Marianne's eyes, which of course links to the film's themes of the gaze. I love how omnipresent the ambient sound is throughout this movie, with the fire constantly crackling and the waves constantly crashing against the rocks, reinforcing the main imagery and themes in the movie. And I love how seamless it all is. Not so much artificial, but homegrown and real. And there's no bigger contributor to that than Noémie Merlan and Adèle Haenel. I may be pronouncing those names wrong, sorry if I am, but they are both exceptional here, with both performances being among my favourites of the year so far. For a film about what it means to gaze upon something or someone, both actors here have an amazing, an understated grasp of subtlety that I wonder how I haven't heard either name before. It's a weird thing to say, but I love how Merlan uses her eyes. The way she darts her eyes back and forth between painting and subject, and it's an absolute wonder to behold. That really illustrates the movie's themes more than anything else in it. While most painters of the time might just see their subject as the object of their painting, the object of their gaze, Marianne lets the audience, and in particular Eloise, know that she thinks deeper than that. She sees Eloise as being more than that, and everything about their relationship is expertly crafted. But before I ramble on too long, let's just say this film is amazing and leave it at that. I should probably stop myself here. Portrait of a Lady on Fire is the kind of movie that forces me to redefine how I evaluate movies. Such is its quality. I have more problems with this film than I do with Uncut Gems, The Lighthouse, Parasite, and especially 1917. This film is a beautifully raw, stunning experience that has symbolism for days whilst also being about a universal theme. Love. It might be tragic, it might be emotional, it might turn you to an emotional wreck by the end, but it's all worth it. In other words, this is a 10 out of 10, and it's taken on that torch of being the movie to beat this year so far. I'll see you next time when we talk about The Photograph, Fantasy Island, Bloodshot, and The Hunt. So I'll see you then.